afterwards. So thank you all for joining us today. It is our first interest group meeting for both the data and the GIS and data interest groups. Today, we're going to be talking about the 2020 census, specifically the urban area updates and what those might mean for your agency. A couple housekeeping notes before we dive in. If you have never attended an interest group meeting before, I want to go over a few items. So first and foremost, please remain muted unless you are intentionally asking a question during the discussion period. We did have close to 300 registrants for today's meeting, and the moderators really felt it was important to keep you in a meeting format, meaning you would be allowed to unmute and discuss things after presentations. As a result, though, we are keeping an eye on that. We don't want any unnecessary background, so please stay muted if you're not speaking. Also, make good use of the chat box. Feel free to add your questions throughout presentations, answer each other's questions. A lot of the value in these sorts of meetings is really the ability for participants to talk to each other. So feel free to have some side conversations in that chat box, respond to each other, and go ahead and throw your questions in there during presentations. We will do our best to get through as many as possible. If we don't get to answer your question because it is such a large crowd, we will be sure to follow up with you after the meeting. Again, this will be recorded. We'll post this recording 1 week after today's meeting. That goes out with an in case you missed it email. And then finally, if you can update your name, I'm a terrible example, mine says AMPO staff. If you can update it to say your name and organization, that will be very helpful when we go back to do notes, just to make sure that we're getting the right folks for their statements. An additional item I wanted to talk about was some expectations for today's meeting. So urban area and the census data, there's a lot to unpack there, and we are not going to be able to get into the nitty-gritty of everything. The real expectation is for the audience today to walk away with a list of items you need to investigate further. These are going to include things like the adjusted urbanized boundary updates, functional classification updates, and overall planning and programming effects. So this is a higher level conversation. We do have a regional example. We have an NPO coming in to talk to us today as well to give you more tangible examples, but we are not going to be able to deep dive into every little thing. Our hope is you walk away with a list of things you need to be investigating, the resources and the point of context that you need. And finally, a note about participation. I did mention it's going to be a large group today. All of you will have the ability to unmute and participate during discussion, and we want to see that. I know that this topic, just in the prep calls we've had leading up to this, can be a very passionate topic. It's tied to funding, it's tied to a whole lot of things. I want to remind folks that our USDOT representatives, both from Federal Highway and FTA, are on here voluntarily. They are coming to answer questions, they're coming to present material. I'm going to ask everybody to remain respectful to not only them, but our moderators as well. They're volunteering their time to put this call together. So it is completely okay to voice any frustrations you might have with this process, where you are with it, the unknowns. I'm just going to ask that we do it in a very constructive way. And with that, I'm going to introduce today's moderators. So it is a joint meeting today of both our GIS and Data Visualization group and our data group. So from data, we have Kevin Murphy. He served on our leadership team for a couple years now. You can see his bios up on the slide. And we also have Charlene Howard from our GIS group. So they are going to tackle moderating today and introducing our speakers. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to them to let them get us started.
Thanks, Caitlin, and good morning, everybody, and afternoon for those of you who are in the same time zone as I am. So again, I'm Kevin Murphy. I'm with the Skagit Council of Governments, which is a smallish metropolitan planning organization in Western Washington. We're about 130,000 folks. And as you're all aware, through the 2020 census meeting we had last year and things, what we're going to talk about today is kind of fundamental to a lot of things we do as MPOs related to, as mentioned already, functional classification, the urban boundary itself, which means what to funding for surface transportation block grant, for example, and those sorts of programs. Also, to me, it's integrated into what our long-range plan looks like, which facilities we care about, which facilities we plan that are regionally significant. In my region definition is in part defined by functional classification, for example. So I think this is one of the opportunities MPOs have every 10 years to engage in a process that adjusts that boundary, affects roadway classifications, et cetera. And with the recent changes to the census, it's a little bit more contentious, I think, this time around, understanding it and the data that's needed to go behind that. So hopefully today you'll get some sense of the data needed, and Charlene's going to talk more about that and that side of the process. I don't know, Charlene, if you want to mention from the GIS side,
Sure.
what they get out of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're anything like me, sitting back and told to, okay, go get these census urban areas that were just uploaded, just available from the census, you're like, okay, that's great, and we have all this stuff, but then, there's the, and I'm kind of being, tongue in cheek about this, but then there's like the black box urbanized area boundary, and something happens to it, and then we use that for funding decisions and our MPO boundary. And like Kevin said, there are huge implications from the data side, as well as what that data shows to then inform, frankly, like who gets money and who doesn't. So I know that, these kind of data sets touch a lot of different folks, technical folks like myself, policymakers, MPOs, state DOTs, county organizations. So I'm going to launch a poll to just kind of get a feel of who's in our audience, because, we all deal with these on some effect. And wow, this poll is great because we have a huge MPO. I mean, no surprise, but, we have tons of MPO folks here too, but we do have a lot of state DOTs, and we do have to work closely with our DOTs in order for us to still be a relevant MPO, to decide whether, if we've gone under the threshold for what constitutes an MPO, the governor says, hey, you're still relevant. So there's a lot of different things going on. So I'm really excited about this. A little bit selfishly, like, I really wanted this topic because I need to produce things for my MPO and my people. And frankly, like, some of us were here the last time around, but nobody really remembers who did the work. So I think our speakers are going to really, give us a really good education on both sides. So I don't want to take up too much time, but we do have about 80%, and I'm hoping you guys can also see these polls results, but we have 80% MPO, 14% DOT, and then 1% FHW and FTA, which are probably our speakers and their friends, their staff, and then some other. And for the other people, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat just to see where you are, because that might give us a better idea, at least for the speakers, to maybe speak to some of those unique things that might be applicable to where you're coming from. So I'm going to mute, turn it back over to Kevin, and we can get rolling with our speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlene. So our next, as she said, our speaker, we'll move on to the speakers now. And hopefully Joe is with us. So next slide, Caitlin.
Yes, I'm with you. Sorry.
Oh, great. Thanks, Joe. So from FHWA, we have Joseph Hausman. He's worked many, many years, as some of the others around here have as well. But recently, Joseph's been doing a lot of this work directly for FHWA on functional classification, adjusted urban boundaries. So I will turn it over to Joseph to start his presentation. Thank you.
And I think Caitlin's going to run the slides, right? Again, my name is Joe Hausman. I'm with FHWA. I'm in the Office of Planning, Systems and Planning and Analysis team, and headquartered in DC. But I wanted to mention that a couple things. I've been doing this, like you said, for a long, long time. This will be my 4th census, which makes me kind of older, but I've done it at the local level, at the state level, with the Ohio DOT for many years, and then also at FHWA. And we like to talk about functional classification and urban area boundary adjustment pretty much at the same time, because um, the being on the functional classification system means the road's eligible for federal aid. All functional classified roads are eligible for federal aid except local roads and rural minor collectors. So I just wanted to mention that it's really important. And the adjusted urban area boundary, mostly an MPO audience today, it sounds like. And you folks have a big role in this. Really the lead in the urban areas is the MPO. So next slide, please, Caitlin. So this is what I'm going to be talking from. This is our official guidance. It was done about 10 years ago. It's still very valid. And I want to say that there's a few changes that have come about in the latest census update, mainly that they don't talk about urban clusters anymore. So if you read through this document and you think, oh, urban cluster equals smaller urban area that starts at the 5,000 population, you pretty much can use this document. I'm in the process of updating it now, but there's a lot of new regulations on publishing this sort of information on the web, so I'm trying to work through that. So anyway, that's where this is all coming from. We updated it 10 years ago. Went through a fairly major research project on this. And the easiest way I find to find this is to Google it up. It's kind of buried in the Office of Planning information under census issues, but I just look at the HPMS webpage. There's a link to it from there. Just Google up HPMS, Highway Performance Monitoring System, and you can get to this document. And we will post, as soon as we get done here, I'll post the link in the chat. Next slide, please, Caitlin. So what we're going to talk about is functional classification first. Again, this happens all the time. It's a living thing at the state DOTs and the MPOs and everybody else who's involved in the federal aid program, because roads change all the time. But 10 years ago, and when HPMS got reassessed, if you're familiar with the Highway Performance Monitoring System, it's the federal reporting data to Congress that gives the condition and performance of the highways in the country and on all public roads, in fact. Though there's a lot more information on higher functional classification, principally federal aid roads. And as I mentioned, all federally aid roads are defined as all these functional classifications that are here, except for rural minor locals. So this is kind of was a big change. Before this, a functional classification was broken into two pieces: an urban and rural classification. There was 1 through 9 on the rural side and 11 through 19 on the urban side. Right now, what we do is we combine it with an urban and rural code in our data at FHWA. So again, 7 of them, they're balanced on both sides of the urban area boundary. And this is something that we wanted to talk to folks about. Next slide, please. So we talk a lot about functional classification and mobility, or the lack of it. Generally, your higher level facility roads like interstates or other freeway expressways, those have a lot of mobility, but not a lot of local access. They're usually long distance roads with access to other systems roads at a fairly large interval, and it can be quite long. This is just an idea of perfect mobility. There's no way to get in and out of this tunnel in Colorado. So that would be, of course, an urban interstate. And so that's just a diagram of that. Next slide, please. And at the other end is the access. So you think about roads in that range. You've got perfect access, in this case, the cul-de-sac. There's no mobility involved at all. It's just for getting to your local house in a neighborhood, which may lead to the road that leads to is probably a collector of some sort. Could be higher depending on where it goes and the volumes on it. Next slide, please. The kind of things that influence functional classification. Trip length, how long are you traveling on this road? Is an interconnecting road between major population hubs throughout a state, for example, that'll influence how you functionally classify a road and how many access points there are along it. Of course, as we showed in the mobility example before, there's not much access, and then on local roads or lower level functional class roads, there are. And it's all impacted by speed limit, route spacing, usage, traffic volume, number of lanes, and connectivity to activity centers. And really some of it becomes an art over time. When you start looking at these roads and see how they're classified and the criteria that's used to do them, you can almost spot them just by looking at them, a picture of one, or looking at them on a map or an aerial photo, however you're doing this. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And so there's a little bit of an art in it, but a lot of it has to do with the VMT of the road. And it also has to do with the VMT in the context of the road. In New York City, minor arterial may be something a lot different than, say, in Albany, New York, or some other city that's even smaller. Even on the rural side, there's a lot of local context involved in this. Next slide, please. So we talk about continuity. One thing about functional classification, when you look at these roads, you have to think about how traffic flows through them. For example, the principal arterials are supposed to be an interconnected system of principal arterials. And also, you don't want to dump roads into a lower functional classification with no place for the traffic to go. And like I said, an interconnected system of principal arterials, the lower level roads may not be that way. They may serve local traffic generators or facilities that cause that. Think of a stadium or something that does major traffic generation. A road may change functional classification at the access point. And then there's these natural boundaries is what we're trying to show in this picture. In Wings Neck Road, Bourne, Massachusetts, the road just runs out of land. So that also will change the functional classification. But in general, an interconnected system of principal arterials, roads have to make sense about what they connect to. You can't dump a 20,000 ADT into a 2,000 ADT capacity road. I say ADT, that's average daily traffic. At FHWA, we use annual average daily traffic, but it's the same sort of thing. Next slide, please. The difference between urban and rural. You can see the upper picture here has a tighter road grid, a lot more population. And one thing these pictures point out is most roads are local roads, about 50%. And in the upper, maybe even more. I think in the overall national statistics is there's 1 million miles of road that are on the federal aid program, and out of the over 4 million miles of roads, public roads that we have. So you can see most roads are local. They're not federally aided. And the characteristics are different in urban and rural. The urban ones tend to, again, move traffic around the urban area. Some of the roads move traffic between several urban areas or across the state, and they get classified appropriately, but a tighter grid pattern and a different way to look at them. This is why when the urban area boundaries get adjusted, you need to take a look at what's going on around the edges of the urban area, because the criteria that are used to do that can change. And on the rural side, more spread out, more farm to market, a lot of local roads still. They mostly connect smaller centers of population ultimately to the large one. So it really has to look at the land use and the density, things like that. Next slide, please. If any of you are familiar with HPMS, the old HPMS 8, which has been retired, are coming out with HPMS 9 now. You could make functional classification maps. And I made this map some years ago, and I thought it was a good representation of an urban area, and it has all the functional classifications in here. You'll see the interstates are in blue, other freeway expressways are in purple. And again, another freeway expressway tends to look like, I call them interstate lookalikes, but they could have some at-grade access, but mostly grade separated. Think about some major highways that are 4-lane divided that kind of maybe have both. Or in a lot of cases, some states would say, no, they don't have any at all, no at-grade access. Depends on their definition. We'll go either way, we'll allow it. Principal arterials in red, and the minor arterials are in kind of a black color on this map, and then you have the collectors. Now, what you'll notice if you look closely at this map, that there are no minor collectors. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think that Boston is one of the states that chose not to divide their urban collectors into major and minor. That was an option when we revised this, that a state at their option could go major and minor collector in the urban area. All are eligible for federal aid. It used to be that there were just collectors in the urban area under the older programs, but again, you can now divide them up into major and minor. But on the rural side, there's only rural collectors. Rural collectors are not eligible. I'm sorry, there's major and minor collectors on the rural side. Sorry about my phone. But the rural minor collectors are not eligible for federal aid, and that's always been that way. So what we were trying to do here was balance out the collectors between the urban and rural side of things. Next slide, please. So flexibility and overlap. The guidebook that we have out there right now is mostly is what it is. It's a guidebook. And there's a lot of flexibility in the federal aid program, and we rely a lot on local knowledge. And there's the tough part of rating a road and how to get it on the functional classified program is where they overlap between arterial, collector, and local. And they can be tough, but you know, common sense here, a good guide. You know, most of you are planners, know what these roads look like after a while, and make a decision at these overlap points based on AADT or density criteria, things like that. Next slide, please. By the way, this is we do this. There's a lot more slides to this. I've cut out most of them. It's an hour, at least an hour presentation, and we've taken out a lot of the things that are in here, but I think this gets to the points of the things that we're showing. So when you GIS, we talk about GIS. I'm really a GIS person. I'm an expert in linear referencing and dynamic segmentation and about how the state DOTs use that. I did a lot of work in that area and how to make it take an enterprise approach to GIS at large organizations. And so GIS was a big part of this, and we wanted to bring that out in our New York guidance because this is how you're going to work with the state in the future. You're going to look for gaps in the data, especially as data is dynamically segmented and put into an LRS and GIS. LRS, linear referencing system, it's just another way to locate data on a map. It's kind of the language of highways. It's usually looked at in route ID, mileposts, things like that. So if your data matches that, it'll map. In this case, the upper blow up on this picture shows a gap. You want to look for things like that. You want to look for irregularities on where the functional classification changes. Does it make sense to dump a principal arterial into a collector, like I mentioned earlier? You don't want that because the ADT is not there, or it just doesn't make sense. There's got to be a reason for it. So this is a good way to really do analysis of the data and make sure that the underlying data that makes a functional classification like ADT makes sense. Also, some states, the MPOs especially, use their travel demand and forecasting models a lot of times to fill in the data and understand where things are moving through their organization, through their area, planning area. And a lot of this can impact the functional classification. But GIS is really an important part of doing the analysis of the data in the functional classification process. I should also say that for folks who develop HPMS data, that as you do spatial intersections and you're looking at how the data fits into the boundaries of urban and rural, that needs to match up with what's submitted to FHWA. So that's another way to use GIS for spatial intersections between polygons and line work. Next slide, please. So we do have a schedule on this that we recommend. It used to be that we had problems at FHWA with states not getting their functional classification or urban area boundaries submitted to FHWA in a timely process. We'd see 7, 8 years after the urban area boundaries came out, and the whole country was on a different schedule for getting this information in. And we report this data to Congress, and we also use it for highway statistics and other programs. And if the functional classification is out of date in one state and up to date in another, and the urban boundaries are out of date and up to date in one other, it causes real problems and continuity in the data. So we think that after the boundaries are adjusted, it should take about 24 months to do a functional classification update for the entire state. Now, again, the local governments are involved, MPOs are involved. MPOs are responsible for the urban areas. And ultimately, though, it's reported to the state. The state is the final stateside authority, and our division offices at FHWA actually approve the functional classification changes. Again, most of this happens when the urban area boundaries are adjusted because it's just such a big change across the country, but it all happens all the time. You may have a new road that's built, you may have a new facilities that are built, normal urban growth or rural growth can cause a functional classification to change over time. And our division offices at FHWA should work with the state to make sure that they have a process to update the functional classification over time. Today, we do things again in GIS. You need a team that does it more than likely. Most states have that. You may have some sort of planning method or documentation on how it should be done. Generate maps electronically, use GIS, try to stay on time and get it into to give you this. Now, for example, the urban area boundaries, we're going to cover this in a minute, but I'll cover it real quick here. We're launched on December 29th, 2022. So we asked the states to take 1 year to update their urban area boundaries. And then following that, they have another 24 months to do the functional classification. So the latest time that this should be done, this data should be submitted to FHWA through HPMS and also other things that we do to collect the boundary data, is by December 29th, 2025, to be submitted in the 2026 HPMS data. So kind of give you an idea what we think is a reasonable timeline on this. Next slide, please. And we also came up with some standard mapping colors for the cartographic types that are on this webinar. So this is what the colors that you should be using for your functional classification maps. Next slide, please. Real quick on the urban area, urban rural definitions. Again, FHWA planning issues, just Google that up. You'll take it to where we have a lot of information about this. Again, a little bit, this is where some changes happened from our guidance. We again talked about urban clusters before. There are no urban clusters anymore. Urban areas start at a population of 5,000 and go up from there. The Census Bureau does not break them out in any way, but FHWA will. And also they use housing density as a criteria for creating urban areas, and FHWA does not use that. It just uses the population. So for FHWA, all urban areas are 5,000 above. It's always been that way. There's no real change there. It used to be clusters went down to 2,500 from the Census Bureau, and we considered those rural. So today what we'll do is get a list of urban areas from the Census Bureau, and there could be some below 5,000 because they use housing density to develop those urban areas. We would consider those rural in our analysis. And above 5,000, we have a couple breakpoints. 5,000 is where small urban areas begin. Large urban areas start at 50,000. That's where an MPO is required. And then above 200,000 is where a TMA is required. So that's really a separate topic from what I talked about, but that's kind of how we're looking at the data. Get the population sorted by population, and then build in those breakpoints for the needs that we've always had at FHWA. Next slide, please. This is just showing the schedule and this is from an earlier slide, but this is kind of how the data came out from the Census Bureau this year and how they released the urban area boundaries. They started out with criteria, proposed and final. They reviewed comments over the summer of 2021 and came out in fall 2022. Now, when I say fall, it was very, very, very late fall, which is really winter when you look at December 29th, 2022. But they came out late last year, and they were released on December 29th. And you can get this data, the new urban area boundary data, out on the census website. Also, we have it available for download on the HEP GIS website. That's our internal planning, external and internal planning GIS website. Those boundaries are available there. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a summary of about how the census delineated the 2020 urban areas. You can see the population is now 5,000. It used to be 2,500. Again, that aligns with what FHWA has always done. It's always been 5,000 for us when we started looking at urban areas. Again, small urban areas are 5 to 50,000. Urbanized areas are 50,000 and above, and TMA start at 200,000. They also, and the census has taken a different way of doing this. They made some changes. A lot of it has to do with differential privacy and perturbation that they have to do and are required to do. So they started using housing density to help in defining urban areas. They reduced the maximum jump distance from 2.5 to 1.5 miles. I know there's been some controversy in that because it's broken up some areas that might have had a larger population because you can't jump to the other one. Make it a bigger urban area than it is. It may have created 2 smaller urban areas, or maybe one big part of it became rural. You know, there's a lot can happen there. And also the one big thing I want to mention here is they're using LEHD, worker flow characteristic data, to delineate between large urban agglomerations. Think, the Northeast corridor where a lot of these things run into each other. They want to see where people really live and work, and so that they can divide it more appropriately. Next slide, please. This is just showing some impacts of what happened when the jump distance changed. You can see that it's quite some distance here, and now it's down to 1.5 miles. Next slide, please. This just shows how, again, how we look at FHWA looks at the 2020 urban area definition. The Census Bureau is 5,000 or 2,000 housing units. They look at housing units as 2.5 people per housing unit, so times 2,000, that equals 5,000. They also get the population threshold of 5,000. Again, we use only the population, and so you can see that in the lower chart. Population 5,000 plus urban, then small urban and urbanized areas. Again, the TMA is not marked here, but we also look at that. Next slide, please. So adjusting the urban area boundaries. So this is just some idea where the authority comes from. It lies with the states. Yeah, again, MPOs, metropolitan planning areas, they're the folks who look at the, whether it's, look at the urbanized area when it comes to this, how to adjust it. They recommend it to the state DOT. Also, local governments can get involved that way. Plus, if it's in the rural side, you know, there's some smaller urban areas out there that we would go, or we would expect that the state would work with these local governments to do that as well. Again, the FHWA authority on this is the FHWA division administrators. And want to make a point though, the MPOs are the folks who are responsible for the urbanized areas and their adjustment in the urban areas. So if that's the case for you, then you need to take a look at that and work with the state DOT to get that done. Now, in the state DOT I came from, we would do all this for the local governments. We did it for the MPOs. We'd adjust the boundaries. We had formulas for that. We'd send them out to all the MPOs and all the local governments in the state and let them essentially throw darts at them to adjust them to with their local knowledge. A lot of states do that differently. They may rely entirely on the MPO to build the mapping and adjusted boundaries. So it depends on the state. Next slide, please. So real quick, why do you adjust the boundaries? Well, you don't have to. You can leave the census boundaries the way they are. The problem with the census boundaries is they're computer generated, automated boundaries. They don't care where transportation facilities are, and we're in the transportation business. So we don't like to see maps where the roads go in and out of the urban area. Or there may be some local knowledge about something that's happened in the 2 years since the census was done by the time these boundaries come out. And you might want to include some development or something that you think is urban that the census classified as rural from their business rules. So there's some reasons to do the adjustment. And you know, this is just a kind of an idea of a map. You want a clean map that either the road's in or out, the interchange is in or out. It's just not a good idea to split transportation facilities on these boundaries. A lot of irregular shapes, things like that. And again, I talk about this consistency with functional classification. If you do a spatial intersect with this boundary you've developed, you should get the same kind of data that you would have in your databases that are submitted to HPMS. Next slide, please. The state I came from, we had some business rules to develop the boundaries. First of all, we included an entire municipality as we adjusted. Perhaps there were annexations or growth in a city. You'd want to make sure the boundary was completely enclosed with the city boundary, or be at least consistent with it, so that you don't have half of a city or rural and half of it urban, or part of it urban and part of it rural. It's just not a good idea. Again, large traffic generators, airports, things that happen around the fridges that you might want to include. The next slide, please. This is just some ideas of what a map looks like in one of the states. This is in Arizona, and a professional looking map was developed. This is again for 2010. We haven't seen new ones yet, of course, since the boundaries just came out. Don't split roadways. The only question I would have about this particular map is there's a lot of rural in it. Why is that rural coded as urban? Maybe there's a reason, I don't know, but it looks kind of odd. Maybe on the lower right-hand side of it, perhaps the boundary should have been more closely aligned with what the census boundary is, which is the pink shaded area. Next slide, please. Just some ideas on what the boundaries need to do when you adjust them for transportation purposes. You don't have to, first of all, but if you do, the boundary has to be greater than or equal to the Census Bureau urban area. I would like to, I say we expand them outwardly. We don't, some people say smoothing. Smoothing to me has a different connotation. So I've always called it adjusting the urban area outwardly. So I've talked about most of these already. I'm not going to go through them again. So let's go to the next slide. There's also a relationship between the boundaries that we all know about as planners. But in this one, the census boundary is in Monroe, Louisiana. In this case, it's that kind of mustard green color. And then the adjusted urban boundary is quite a bit larger. It's that blue area. Then the MPO boundary, planning boundary, is the bigger polygon. So they all should have some sort of relationship. They all should kind of contain each other the way this one does. And just think about that as you're doing a lot of MPOs. I think the planning areas are the metropolitan statistical areas. So some are, some aren't. Depends on how they what they decide to do. I think that's an option for their planning area. So anyway, this is just kind of showing a relationship between them and what they kind of look like in a real map. Next slide, please. I talked about schedule. This adjustment of the boundaries usually comes before the functional classification, though a lot of this can be done concurrently if you do regions of the state. Where I was from, they had 100 urban areas. You could get one urban area done and you could adjust the functional classification. So there's not a reason why it can't happen concurrently. But the whole idea is that this will all be done within 36 months of the original boundary census, again, which was, I'll repeat it one more time, December 29th, 2022. And 1 year after that, you should have the boundaries done. 2 years after that, boundaries are done. You should have the functional classification adjusted. So anyway, this is the schedule we would encourage. There are some exceptions occasionally. There needs to be good reasons for those. The division will work with you on that, the FHWA division office. Next slide, please. That's it. Again, my name is Joe Hossman. I am in the Office of Planning in our DC headquarters. And then Supan Yoder, she does the HEP GIS. So that's a great resource for planners. It has a lot of stuff on equity, functional classification, the national highway system. If you're interested in the old primary system for advertising device control and things like that, that's all out there. So there's a lot of good information on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We do have time for a few questions. Probably the best way to do this is to raise your hand, given the 188 participants we currently have, or drop questions in the chat. And as a reminder, if we can't get to them today, they are being collected and there will be an attempt to answer your questions within the next, and get it out about a week or so from now. So with that, anybody have a question?
And maybe while we're waiting or in the background, if you can, I'm going to launch another poll question because we talked a lot about data and we're just curious and who has looked at the data yet. So fill this out, ask a question, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin.
And I'm not seeing anybody with their hand raised, though. Maybe I'm not seeing the hand raised.
Looks like we have Myron Lee.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm the MPO director here in Southern Utah, and we need to adjust our planning boundary and our smooth boundary based on the fact that our urban boundary has increased. I don't think these urban boundaries have been adjusted since 2000. I'm not sure anyone at the state DOT understands how to do that. What would you advise to get started into the process?
I would advise that we do our training course that we have. Supan and I do a training. We just did North Dakota last week. And we go through our full slide deck and we talk to them about all the concepts. What I didn't show you today is we have a lot of data that first of all, we break this country into urban and rural states based on how many people live in the urban areas, how many live in the rural areas. What turns out that if you live about 75% of your population living in the urban area, then we consider an urban state, and a rural state would be less than that. And that breaks the country about in half. But I think that explaining these processes to the state DOT and what they should be looking for is important. Now, the Utah division should be aware of all this. In fact, I did training there a little while ago, so hopefully they're in a lot better condition than they were last time. So I know that they're aware of this. They've been trained on what they need to do. I would reach out to them, our division office, or I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head who to reach out to at our division, but I can find that for you and make sure that they're up to speed on this and that they can assist. So again, training is the important part. And again, it's not acceptable if the old adjusted boundaries are smaller than the new urban area boundaries from the census. That's not acceptable and to be rejected. And we do review the urban areas. We review them. We work with the state DOT on getting the new boundaries as they come out, and then we review them on how they fit in with the different rules. In our bigger presentation, we go through a bunch of errors that we see. Things like the boundaries don't match up with a neighboring state properly. That's a big thing. Or that when you've got a bunch of different urban areas near each other, maybe they weren't adjusted properly and they overlap other ones, or they don't include things. It can get pretty ugly depending on the state. And then other states are really good at it. So I know that in your case, your state has been trained. Hopefully they're up to speed. We did our best.
Yeah, the problem is that we've had a tremendous amount of turnover the last 3 years, and the whole planning staff has changed out. So I'll just need to know who to reach out to eventually. I'll email you offline.
Okay, it's joseph.hossman@dot.gov.
Thanks. A couple of questions have been raised in the chat about getting the PowerPoint out to folks. We can do that. I mean, it's all part of this, and it's up on the Trello site, so we can probably send it out to all the participants after the meeting. Also, reading one of the interesting questions, Tina, do you want to ask your question verbally? It's interesting. So Tina Johnson was asking, this iteration, there are discontinuous boundaries. Will we be able to leave them as such, or will there be instructions on connecting them to the main urban boundary?
What kind of boundaries? I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
The chat is, this iteration, there are discontinuous boundaries.
Well, when you look at my record, I haven't looked at the urban area boundary data in a while, but when you look at that, it'll identify what the urban area boundary is, and if it's part of that main urban area boundary, yes, you could include it. You could also include it outside the main boundary, depending on your business rules and what you think is appropriate for an urban area. So you do have a lot of latitude, but generally it's one urban area boundary to one adjusted urban area boundary to one urban area. But there are some times where it makes sense to expand it across that. So that might
right, and maybe this is if there is a small urban area boundary that's not connected to the main urban area boundary, can the adjusted urban boundary expand to include the small urban boundary?
It can, but the small urban area boundary still exists. So it doesn't go into its population or anything like that. It's kind of a weird thing. The way that FHWA looks at this is that the urban areas retain their original census population even when they're expanded. And maybe some old timers remember when HPMS used to require an estimate on the adjusted urban area population, but we don't do that anymore. So whenever we refer to an urban area, we're going to refer to the population. And I think if it's close, I think you could include it. I'm not sure what that's going to give you, but yeah, because you can also adjust the small ones. You can adjust all of them. You may want to you may want to do it like have the big one adjusted up to the edge of the small one, adjust both of them. It depends. It's probably the better way to do it, because that way you keep the original criteria together of the original urban areas. But we have flexibility in that. And I think that's kind of a case by case basis. We need to look at that and see what makes sense.
And I think that's a good point. I just want to emphasize on this call, as Joe mentioned, you can, in that smoothing process, the adjusted urbanized boundary process, reach out a little bit if it makes sense and is justified, but you are not going to pick up that population and you are not going to pick up any correlating funding. So if you extend your boundary at all for any reason, you don't get that extra funding. That's something to keep in mind. That is all based on the actual original data.
Yeah,
Hello.
it's, I don't want to be wishy-washy on this, but it depends on these cases. We go back to the original urban area population for population purposes. We don't count that into the adjusted urban area.
Hey, Joe,
Go
Yeah.
ahead, dear.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. This is Tina Thompson. I used to be a hatcher. You know me.
Yes.
What I'm looking at is we have where there are hops and jumps that go like up to like the 1.5 miles away from the urban area. The last iteration, the Census Bureau had connected them with the rural areas in between.
Right.
This iteration, they did not. It's in their document that they're not contiguous. And the
Right.
question is there a requirement from Federal Highway to connect those islands of the same urban area to the main urban area? I could share a screen if you want, so you can just get a visual.
Well, I think what you're saying is that, now are you saying that it's not the same urban area anymore, but it used to be, or are you saying that they just have a gap between them?
They have a gap between them.
So
They're
it's still
both
part
the
of the
same.
bigger urban
They,
area.
yes.
Is it a requirement? The requirement is that you have to be greater than or equal to the census urban area boundary. That's the main requirement. So you would have, you don't have to make it a continuous, I don't think you really have to make it a contiguous polygon, but I think it would be a good idea to do so.
And I agree, but then there's also politics involved. I'm sure in some areas, not all states and all
Yeah.
MPOs within all states will react the same. So we were looking for guidance.
Right. Again, I think the main thing to think about here is that you don't even have to adjust them. You can go with the original census boundary. So that would naturally create that gap you're talking about. If you're adjusting them and they're that close, why not include it and make it a nice smooth polygon?
I understand completely. I just was
Okay.
looking for if there was a strong direction either way.
No, it's really up to you.
Instructions either way.
Again, this is a planning effort. You need to go back to what makes sense for the area. Does it make sense to expand the urban area boundary out, considering that you want to keep the roads from going through going in and out of the boundaries, and you want to make sure you create the right boundary based on what you know locally. So it's really, there's some flexibility there, I guess would be the best way to say it.
Okay.
All right.
Good to know.
Thank
Thank you.
folks.
Appreciate it.
We're going to need to move on to the next segment of our meeting today, given we extended it for 1.5 hours, and we could talk, like Joe said, we could talk about this stuff for hours.
Yeah, if you
so
have
with
questions,
that,
send me an email.
Yeah, and we will, like I said, we will gather the questions, and Ample staff will make sure everybody gets the PowerPoint. So with that, I'll turn it over to Charlene to move us ahead. Thank you.
Hey, great. Thank you. And thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody who put things in the chat. I was looking, and Aaron from BMC did have a question about the MPO perspective, and hopefully our next speaker will give some insight into that. I did also notice a couple things about deadlines to adjust the urbanized boundaries. I think Joe did have a slide with that. I believe it was maybe a year and then 2 years for the functional classification, but hopefully those answers will be realized. Maybe Joe or somebody else can maybe put that in the chat so we can move on, excuse me, to to Matt. So I would like to introduce Matt Molinex from the Hagerstown Eastern Panhandle Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm excited because it's also a multi-state MPO, much like I'm from the DC area and we have 3 states. So that brings a whole another set of challenges on top of all of this. How do you do this stuff? How do you make new data? So Matt's going to be talking about kind of now what's the action, some of the things to consider when you're looking at this, possibly how to do some of it and all things like that. So I'm going to stop sharing this poll and give it over to Matt. And please just keep on asking things in the chat, talk amongst yourselves, and let's hear from the MPO side. Thanks, Matt.
Yep. Thank you very much, Charlene. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. My name is Matt Molinex. I'm the Executive Director of the Hagerstown Eastern Panhandle MPO, and I want to thank the AMPO staff and folks from the GIS Visualization Group and the Data Group for having me here today to talk about the 2020 census areas. So if you're an MPO and that data's just got released, now what, right? And so I appreciate all the information that Joe shared. I know I got a lot out of that, and while this presentation will certainly not be in as depth as Joe's, I hope that the conversation that it generates is just as meaningful. Okay. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give just a couple quick items or topics that the presentation will touch on. So I want to give a little bit of context as to my MPO, just because there are a number of variables in how MPOs work. And I know when I see a presentation from another MPO, I kind of want to know if how those variables line up with mine and whether or not I might need to do a little bit something more on my end to change one of those variables so I can make it work like someone else that I see. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context about our MPO. I'll talk a little bit about GIS data. And once you have that 2020 census urban boundary, what that means in terms of how you should review your organization setup, how that may impact funding changes, what planning impacts you might have, and some additional resources. Okay. So next slide, please. So a little context about HEP MPO. So we were established in 1996. There we are in the yellow right there. We're a multi-state MPO. We have Maryland as our lead state, covering Washington County, Maryland. We also include West Virginia, Berkeley, and Jefferson counties. And then our urbanized area, following the 2010 census, snaked into Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And following the 2020 census, snaked into Frederick County, Virginia. So we're a multi-state MPO in full effect. So we are a non-TMA, just barely. We have a population based on the 2020 census of just under 198,000. If we had stayed in the 2010 criteria, we would be a TMA, and I'd be sub-allocating TAP funds right now. But that's not the case, so we'll see what happens come 2030. We have 2 full-time staff. We have 2 part-time staff members. We rely on consultants to assist us with our travel demand model and air quality conformity and determination analysis. Our annual budget is just a little over $500,000. I'm sure every MPO on a call has a unique story of how your organization came to be, exists, and functions. For us, Washington County, Maryland government kind of acts as our bank. They are our budget. They are through who we seek reimbursement from Federal Highway, FTA, and our state DOTs. However, we are technically employees of the Region 9 Planning and Development Council in West Virginia. So it makes for a lot of paperwork, but we get the job done. We as an MPO, even though we are a smaller MPO, we do our best. We try to be progressive in our transportation planning. We're thrilled that for the first time in our organization's history, our policy board chair and vice chair are executive directors from public transit agencies, respectively. And so when it comes to planning and what we're able to do, we always try to punch above our weight class. And then lastly, we previously were a maintenance area for the old 97 annual PM 2.5 NOx that was revoked in October of 2016. So we are currently in attainment for all critical pollutants. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and my MPO. Okay, next slide, please. So for GIS data, it was mentioned earlier in Joe's presentation. I'll say that HEP MPO loves HEP GIS, so I would recommend you go to Federal Highway's HEP GIS website. You can download the 2020 urban area boundaries there, and they include population and housing data already joined into it. If you go to the census site, unless they changed it, the last time I looked, you had to download the geometry as well as a number, at least 2 separate tables that then you had to work backwards and join in. So save yourself some steps. You can also download the metropolitan planning area boundaries that Federal Highway has for 2020. You can also get the 2010 urbanized areas. If you're looking for any adjusted urbanized area, you probably need to talk either with older MPO staff members, or you need to check in with your state DOTs. The question the gentleman had earlier about staff turnover is well taken and is very salient. I know one of the state DOTs that we're working with, pretty much all their GIS staff that were involved in the 2010 adjusted urbanized area boundary effort are no longer there. And so they're really trying to start the process from scratch through reverse engineering. And they have a number of files that have some variation of _1, _2, V3 adjusted urbanized area boundary that they are trying to sift through. So for all the GIS folks that are going to be undertaking this, just do good practices, right? Document, put it in the metadata, and share it with folks just in the event that you move on to greener pastures. And lastly, you want to get a hold of your federal functional class road data. Your state DOTs can have that. As Joe alluded to, you can do a lot of fun analysis in GIS with determining what federal functional class you have. You can intersect it with your boundaries, both in 2010, both in old. You can do queries to try to find out what is now, or intersects and queries to figure out what is now urban versus what is rural in an urban area or no longer an urban area. So those are the data I would recommend obtaining. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is our 2020 urban area. So that's Washington County, Maryland to the north. Our area, sorry, Michaela's on the call, so I'll say our area. She's a transportation planner. Our area is separated by the Potomac River, heading down to the nation's headwaters, nation's capital's headwaters, and then we have West Virginia, Eastern Panhandle to the south. It's hard to tell at this scale, but if you zoom in, there are, this is a multi-part, non-contiguous urban area. And then you see our population is just under 200,000. Next slide, please. And so what this map is showing here is that any area that shows up as in yellow is a 2010 only area. So you see, we lost a lot of our 2010 urban area, around 13 square miles, when the new census criteria was applied to how urban areas were defined. Again, Joe talked about the difference between the jumps, the allowance of non-contiguous areas, the density thresholds, switching from population to housing, and how those were bumped up. So all those played a role in what you see, which is a very different urban area in a lot of ways than what we had in 2010. Next slide, please. So for our area, how that shakes out is that again, we lost the area, but we gained population. So there is Maryland, which is our lead state because it has the greatest amount of population, actually overall is decreasing, with West Virginia bumping up. And then you see Virginia is added now into our 2020 urban area with a small population, and that has planning ramifications that honestly we're working through right now. Right to this, right up until this presentation started, I was in communications with the Winchester MPO. Okay, next slide, please. So now that you go through the process, you get your GIS data, you're analyzing it, you're reviewing it, you have numbers. Now what do you start to do? So there's a broad range of organizational impacts I think that you need to consider. So the first thing I would suggest is that you review your bylaws for any representation changes that might need to be made on your policy boards, on your technical committees, based on your new population or based on your new area. So if your urban area or your metropolitan planning area now extends into new locations, how are those folks represented? If your policy board makeup is based up on percentage populations, you should examine that. If seats on your policy board are given wholesale to a certain municipality versus another one, you may have to look if that municipality is still even in your urban area. Second, I would suggest is that you need to review any planning agreements that you have among MPOs if you have an overlapping urban area or metropolitan planning area as a result of the 2020 census. And that's what we're working through right now at my MPO with the Winfred MPO in Winchester, Virginia, where their planning area, our planning areas came right to the county line, and now our new urban area comes across into their MPA. So we're working through that right now. If you are an urban area that has a population now of less than 50,000, you may or may not exist in the future. And I don't think anyone today can answer that question. But I know that at least in one of the states that we were a part of, one of those MPOs did dip below 50,000. And so I know that our state DOT partners are working hard with our Federal Highway Division folks to try to ascertain what exactly that means, whether or not they should continue as is with their funding, whether the governor may, has any desire to, eliminate them or reduce funding to them. I'm not really sure, but it's something to be aware of. If your urban area population crested 200,000, then come spring, summer this year, you're going to be designated officially as a transportation management area. And that's going to mean a lot of changes for you. You'll no longer be able to self-certify your metropolitan transportation planning process. You have a timeline that starts for developing a congestion management process. You'll be sub-allocated transportation alternative program funds. And this also will have consequences on your public transit agencies in your TMA area, where it's going to change the federal funding ratios for operating. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so funding impacts. So I believe this was on the timeline, one of the timelines that Joe shared, or at least I know it's in one of the resources he shared, but state DOTs now that are heading toward this October 1st deadline of this year, where they have to revisit their PL funding distribution formulas to utilize the new 2020 population figures that the census released. So this may or may not give you a bigger or smaller slice of a bigger pie, depending on how the state DOT slice it. Is my understanding in my review that PL funds were bumped for every year under IIJA. So I assume every state's going to have a slightly bigger pie, but how state DOTs apportion or suballocate PL funds can differ. One state might do a base allocation of a certain amount, and then the rest above that is distributed as a ratio of that MPO's urban area relative to the state's overall. Some state DOTs I know, they do a formula that uses the ratio of the MPO's population to the states. There's a multiplier if you're a non-attainment area. There's a multiplier if you're TMA. So I just become familiar with that if you're not already, because state DOTs should be revisiting it soon. This funding impacts also suballocated funds such as the carbon reduction program. So in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, which was just released in January, the funding tables for MPO suballocated CRP funds are using 2010 population numbers. Moving forward for the rest of the life of IIJA, I expect they're going to use 2020 numbers. That may not be a big deal if you're a smaller MPO. It may only be a couple $1,000s more or less, but for larger MPOs, it could be a big deal. You also may want to be familiar with, and I know the state DOTs that we're involved in, IIJA prescribed that for SDBG funds to be allocated, that must be through an equitable distribution through a consultative process with MPOs, with non-TMA MPOs. So while in the two states that I'm with haven't developed that policy yet, I know that they are getting close. And so how that is finalized based on 2020 population numbers is going to be critical to keep an eye on for all MPOs. Yeah. Next slide, please. planning impacts. So you've got these new boundaries. You need to take a good hard look to see if there's any new areas that need to be incorporated into your next metropolitan transportation plan and your next transportation improvement program. And there's a lot of details about when what update needs to include this, by what time, on Federal Highway's schedule of activities site, which I'll have a link to at the end of my presentation. Any new areas that have come into your fold, you need to review their current air quality conformity determinations for all critical pollutants. You should review any new areas, any new planning agreements to determine if you need to make any changes to your regional travel demand models. When we went through in 2010, the process of a small portion of Pennsylvania becoming part of our urbanized area, we had to go through a process of establishing an agreement whereby the Franklin County MPO in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, was going to be the ones to handle the metropolitan planning process for the entire county. That was the TIP, that was the MTP, that was future updates. Now, we worked out where we coordinate cross boundaries. We have non-voting seats on our respective policy boards and TACs between our MPO and the Pennsylvania MPO, but that's a process that you need to go through. You want to take a good look at, regional travel demand. Yeah, so if you have a new area, I mean, my gosh, it could be you have new external stations. I mean, it could be very different. So again, just something you need to consider. So for multi-part urban areas, which are kind of crazy and wild from a geographer's perspective, but they can impact what was previously considered urban and rural in terms of federal transportation discretionary grants. Now, you want to pay very close attention to the language that is in the NOFOs, future NOFOs, current and future NOFOs of some of these major grants like MEGA, Infra, RAISE, CRISI. I'm forgetting about 50, but you get the idea. You really want to take a good look at the projects or the things that you had planning in the works and see whether or not now they are urban or rural. And this lastly, we have just close the chat. It blocked my words. Great. So urban and rural areas may change the current designations for critical urban, critical rural freight corridor miles and how they're designated. So prior to the release of this new data, every state DOT, every MPO through your areas should have designated critical urban freight corridor miles that are contained within an urbanized area. And then the rural designations were outside. Now you have new boundaries, so you have to take a look at those previous designations, while simultaneously IIJA bumped up for states the overall critical urban and critical rural mileage in total. So there's going to be new miles to designate. So it's an important process to review. And if I'm being honest, in 2012, the reason that we went through the process of adjusting our urban boundary was really trying to get a better representation of the urban landscape in my MPO, specifically for purposes of designating critical freight corridors, especially along Interstate 81. Okay, next slide, please. And these are just some additional resources that are out there. So the census site has been mentioned. Federal Highway has a great MPO TMA designation FAQ. They've got a great schedule of activities. We've talked about HEP GIS, lots of good information there. FTA also has a great site. And then lastly, I would highlight that AMPO stands at the ready to be an additional resource for all the MPOs, so not only AMPO staff or groups like the two that are here today, but also if you've not, you might look into see if your state has any local chapters or local versions of AMPO. We have the Maryland MPO Roundtable, we have the West Virginia Association of MPOs. So I'm hopeful that there's something similar that everyone would be able to access for additional resources. Okay. Next slide, and that will conclude my presentation. And I thank you for your time and attention. I'll turn it back over to Charlene.
Thanks, Matt. I think that really made me think that we have a lot of work to do as far as like making sure these boundaries are as good as they can be. So, everything that they influence can adequately be realized. And I'm turning my camera on now because I can't talk and look at the same time. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions for Matt? Please raise your hand and we will, and we'll call on you and you can unmute. You can also use the chat. And we did mention a few times, Joe and Matt did, about working with the state DOTs, and we did have some in the audience. So if anybody from state DOT wanted to pipe in, I'm going to launch, another chat poll because nobody else is talking here. So if you don't want me to keep doing this, ask some questions. But the question we have for the state DOT coordination is, has your MPO begun working with state DOTs to begin the process of adjusting the urbanized or any functional classification system? And we do have people responding to this poll, so thank you very much. I appreciate the interaction, even if you're not outwardly talking to us. But yeah, I mean, I'm just interested in that as well, because I know, our DOTs are talking about it, at least with some of our, directors, but we haven't had it filter down to us technical people yet. So I don't know if anybody else, if you want to elaborate, Matt or Kevin has any, because, or anybody in the audience. I'm kind of floundering here, guys.
Yeah. Oh.
Charlene, my name is Joe Moriarty. I'm with the New Mexico Department of Transportation. In fact, we have a quarterly, we have an MPO quarterly. The meeting happens every quarter, and this is coming up March 14th, and this is a big subject area for our MPOs. So yes, we're starting the process. We downloaded the boundaries, and we're working through it with our internally and also with our planning partners.
Excellent. And I do, I'm looking back on the chat, and I do, I think it was Teresa LaSalle put something in the chat about coordination between New York DOT and the states. So Teresa, if you're still on and you have a little bit more information, if you could elaborate on that perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I'm just, again, for selfish reasons, I'm just looking like, who do I have to talk to and what do I have to do? But after these presentations, I have my data sets that I am ready to look at as for functional class and how they go in the MPO boundaries. In the DC area, we have our MPO boundary adjusted, but there's areas that weren't their own urban areas are now their own. So I guess technically they're still in our MPO boundary, but they're their own distinct urban areas. So I'm assuming that's okay. We might have to do some little swaps, but
Teresa here, if you want me
excellent. Yes, thank you.
to weigh in.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm realizing that I'm maybe one of the few people who were actually around the last time we did this, and this would be my third census update.
You might be.
So yeah, I mean, without going back through old files and looking, my question was, I do remember last time getting like an official letter from Federal Highway and New York State DOT. We coordinate with DOT. There was what they used to call a small urbanized area adjacent to one of, actually have two urbanized areas within our MPO, and there was a small area that DOT would update the boundary of, and we would coordinate where our two boundaries met. So that's kind of the information. I know that the boundaries are out. I've been very aware of the process and somewhat involved, but from this point forward, I'm not really sure, from the presentation that Joe gave, I'm kind of thinking, oh, we're supposed to start doing this right away. But in the past, I remember maybe it's to the dissemination of the files, because last time, we got a direct, the urban area boundary was sent to us directly with all these instructions and, all the criteria that it had to meet. So that's just kind of what I'm wondering, is that happening again? And if so, when can we expect that? Or is kind of that on us to reach out to Federal Highway and our state DOTs on our own.
Joe, is Joe still here?
Yeah, I'm still here. I was thinking about that a minute.
Awesome.
I wasn't around in the Office of Planning when it happened last time. I wasn't aware that they sent out information, but we do have good guidance that you can look at, and we're available to do training. Just let me know if that would help. But yeah, you should be looking at them now, and you should be, you know, working with the DOT, and that's been our message. So it's not, they haven't been out very long, unfortunately. So it's all this is relatively new. But yeah, you should be looking at them. You should be starting on this. It's not that complicated, and really, I mean, depends on the state. You know, I'm from Ohio. We had 100 urban areas. That's a lot, but some states only have a few. The bigger states, it takes longer. Business rules help a lot. Like I said, you know, come up with a formula on how you're going to do this and let the people throw darts at them when they're ready to go. So yeah, you should be starting. They're out there. They're available. We've done a lot of webinars, and both Supin and I have talked to a lot of states. If you have questions, contact us directly. I know that there have been some things sent out by our office on this as well. I'd have to look into that. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I think we've done that. Yeah, so start, please.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. James
This is
Stack?
Yeah, this is Jim Stack. I'm the
Hi.
I'm on the policy committee for AMPO and the liaison to the data group, but I'm also in New York. I'm the executive director from Rochester, New York. So to Teresa's question, the MPO directors will be bringing this up as part of our regular meetings. There have been staffing changes like everywhere, both at our FHWA New York division and our state DOT planning bureau. So we might be a little behind, but I expect we'll be able to catch up quickly, and you know, we'll definitely be working, all the MPOs working together on a process in New York. So
Thank you, Jim and Joe.
Thank you. Matt, you have a little
Yeah.
hand up there.
I
Come on
did,
back.
sorry. I
No,
went low tech with the
welcome.
hand. I just had a quick question for Joe, maybe something to consider, or maybe it hasn't been. One of the things that I've been running into as we have started talking about on the MPO side, how we want to adjust our urban boundary if we want to go through the process. With all the staff turnover that's happened at state DOTs, a lot of them don't have any record or recollection that are in 2010 our boundaries were ever adjusted. And so I've learned of a small situation where one particular state DOT, when they have a question about whether something's urban or rural, they go to HEP GIS, download the file, and that serves as more or less their authoritative data set for making that determination, versus the adjusted urban boundary that we had sent, maybe 9 to 10 years ago. And so I just wonder if there's been discussion of Federal Highway being a repository for all adjusted urban boundaries specifically on HEP GIS, just because I know that that's where a lot of state DOT planners go to get their data.
It's actually something I'm wondering about too. So thanks for bringing it up.
So I know that I wasn't here last time. I was, like I said, on the HPMS team in those days. And the main reason I did all this guidance, I did this guidance that you see out there today because we see it as data. But I know that Supin went around to all the state DOTs and collected the adjusted urban area boundaries, and we published those. That's where we ran into where we saw mistakes and things. And we planned on doing that. We were hopefully going to include this as part of the HPMS submittal. That's been our plans for some time. That when you update HPMS, you would send a geospatial file and update it that way. That hasn't happened, mainly because HPMS is struggling with its new HPMS 9 software, and they just haven't been able to pick it up. So I imagine we're going to move forward with using HPM or HEP GIS as the repository. I'd say it is the de facto repository today. Everybody uses it, and I believe that's where we will go. We've been talking internally in our office about who's going to look at this and review them. I think Susan and I are going to try to do that together this time. She did it all by herself before, which was a big burden on her. So yeah, I'm pretty much sure as we speak now, that's where we're going to put them. Though we still have some time to work on that. They're not going to be, due in for another almost a year. But yeah, that's where it looks like today is that's where that'll be your go-to GIS.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if there's no further questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Caitlin, but if anything comes up, please. Oh, wait, I see Ray Jones from Texas somewhere. Texarkana.
Yes, Texarkana. Hi, everyone. I'm Radonna. I'm also chairman of the technical committee of AMPO. But I have a question because I have been noticing a lot of people have already updated their MTPs, and I'm getting ready to update mine. So since the adoption of IIJA, are there any shortcuts or things from FHWA that could advise us what all to make sure we include in our MTPs?
So, Donna, are you talking specifically, just broadly speaking, MTP requirements that might be new coming out of IIJA?
Correct. Yes, because I've started. I'm getting ready to put out an RFQ for them, but I also want to make sure I don't miss anything in case FHWA comes back and do a quick check on our MTP to make sure we include all the aspects that need to be, that are requirements.
Yeah, so this is a little bit broader than just the urban areas, it sounds like. So I do know that Federal Highway is working on creating an updated planning rule, which the planning rule really kind of breaks down the implementation of the IIJ and how that's going to affect your planning products. That is scheduled for this year sometime. I can't give you a deadline. I haven't gotten a deadline from Federal Highway. But I can do some legwork on my end and see if we can get a little bit more guidance on that, or maybe what would happen if you are getting ready to say adopt a new MTP and you're worried about meeting those IIJ requirements outside of just the census urban areas. So I'll do some legwork on my end and I'll include that in the notes for today as part of the questions that are asked, and I can connect with you one-on-one as well, Donna.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate both of the speakers. They have brought out a lot of information, different websites and things. With me, I'm a bi-state MPO also, and I work with both states. And down here, FHWA comes out when we get ready to do the urbanized boundary. They'll come out and they'll look at everything and they'll help us, and the state DOTs on both sides, Arkansas and Texas. And like I say, our FHWA partners also help us with that too. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. So I guess now I can turn it over to Caitlin, but I wanted to, okay, that did work. Give a little, that's supposed to be an applause emoji up on there. But I just wanted to thank both of our speakers, and this has been really, I think one of the poll questions had something like, it's stressing me out as one of the answers. So I'm a little stressed, but also very encouraged with the wealth of information we got today. So I think we all probably have some homework, except for you guys that are thick as thieves with your state DOTs and have taken deep dives. But this has been great. So I really appreciate everybody coming out to learn, and our speakers for imparting their knowledge on us. So I'll be quiet now and turn it over to Caitlin.
Perfect. Couple notes and I'll let you all go. There's been a lot of questions about the materials from today. We do send out an in case you missed it email. It goes out 1 week after the event to allow our speakers any time to make updates or edits to their presentation. So we will send out an in case you missed it email next Monday with directions for how to access materials. So be on the lookout for that. Another item I just wanted to plug, if you have very specific niche ideas for maybe where we could take this conversation further, or just other general topic ideas, please reach out to either myself or any of our leadership staff. So Charlene and Kevin, they both moderated today. If you have ideas for maybe future topics for calls like this, please reach out to them, myself, and other leaders so we can capture that. And then I will follow up with everybody. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to contact me. I will be pulling questions down from the chat box to try and get those answered if we didn't get to them all. But feel free to send AMPO any questions at any time. We're always happy to get on the phone with you, do a quick call. I know a lot of your cases are very unique to your regions. So give us a call. We're happy to talk through and advocate where we can and help get you the information you need. And with that, a big thank you to our moderators and speakers. They put a lot of time into this. You don't see the behind the scenes. There are a lot of hours, a lot of emails and meetings that went into putting this together. So a big thank you to them for volunteering their time to put this on. And with that, I will let you all go. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.